This is Things Police See, First-Hand Accounts, with your host, Steve Gould.
Hey guys, welcome to the podcast that interviews active and retired police officers about their most intense, bizarre, and sometimes humorous moments on the job. I am Steve Gould. I am your host. Just as the gentleman said, welcome. This is episode number 86. Guys, we got another sponsor for the show, which I'm psyched out of my mind about. As you know, I don't take on just any sponsors. I want them to align with the podcast, and this is Hero Industries based out of Corona, California. They're designing and manufacturing uniquely branded products for first responders, government agencies, and corporations since the year 2000. So they were right next door to where we lived in SoCal. Awesome company. Somebody in the office reached out. They listen to the podcast in the office. They enjoy it. They're fans, which makes me so happy to have them sponsoring the show. Do you have a upcoming fundraiser? Are you putting together an event that need something to help market it? Holidays are coming up. Do you need gift ideas for your company or organization? Hero Industries has you covered. Hero is known for their cute and adorable Canine Hero plushies and their stunning challenge coins, but that's not all they have to offer. Hero also has custom bottle openers, lapel pins, cigar cutters, tactical teddy bears, and custom badges. Any logo, any badge, any size, any shape, you pick how you want it. Just send Hero your logo and how you want it, and Hero makes it happen. Hero's excellent customer service makes it easy for you to design your items and offers a variety of accessories to pair with your order. Hero Industries has been working with law enforcement, government agencies, and canine handlers through the U.S. since 2000, as I mentioned. They provide top-notch service with amazing details, one-of-a-kind products. Check out Hero Industries on Instagram. That's at Hero_Industries_ Inc. INC. Or go to their website, hero-industries.com. Awesome stuff. Awesome company. Very excited to have them on board, so go check them out. Let's see here. What do we got? What do we got for some music? I think this is the right button. No, that's the crickets. Hold on. I'm going to get it.
Come on, man.
No, that's Joe Biden. Hold on. Hey, guys. No, that's the old closer. Hold on. There we go. All right. Let's get down with our bad selves. Tony Fahey, Corey Payne, Jacob Ruth, Rich Emery, William James Long Investigation, Samantha Harper, the great Gary Steiner, Richard Wilson, Scott O'Donnell, David Diaz, and Timothy Wright. Thank you and bless your hearts for your continued support of the show. It's awesome, guys. I have bills coming in, and I don't even have to think about them because there's sponsors who take care of all that. And I encourage anybody who loves the show. You've binge listens to all the episodes. You love it. Is there anything you can do? Even a couple bucks a month. Become a monthly subscriber. Pays for the website, the editing software I use, the video software. Just it pays for everything, which is fantastic. I'm not trying to make a mint here. I'm just getting my expenses covered, allow me to do this free of charge, and that's all I care. So I mentioned the great Gary Steiner, and I'm happy and proud and honored to announce that he is in fact our guest today, episode number 86. This will be Gary's third appearance. He's a super popular guest. I always get messages about him when he's on. He was a police officer in Santa Monica for many years. He retired a sergeant. He was in investigations and, of course, in patrol. Gary is also a court-recognized expert on confession evidence, and that's kind of what we're going to delve in today. We had part one, and I know Gary is one of these guys who's just a wealth of knowledge. He knows so much about this stuff and get into the nitty-gritty, into the details. I knew this was going to have to be a two-parter. So in this episode, we're going to get down to Gary's qualifications. We're going to get into establishing an environment of trust when you're interviewing and or interrogating somebody, verbal and physical cues, truth-telling styles, and other behaviors that are identified by the interviewer. Gary knows all this stuff. It's extremely fascinating to me, and I think you're going to find the same. So he's going to take us right from street level to all kinds of interviews and how to deal with people and how he's gotten confessions and confession evidence from people. So I'm going to stop flapping my gums here. Without further ado, the great Gary Steiner. Gary, welcome to the show, brother.
Hey, Steve, good to see you again. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for coming on.
So So one of the things that has really gotten to me in law enforcement, going back to the 1990s, was how important it is to get credible information from people. And this goes back to just being a patrol officer when I was taught lessons from my FTOs about the need to corroborate people's identities and how often we stopped offenders for just minor things like jaywalking or some other traffic violation. And the subject that we stopped didn't have ID. They would give a name. There wasn't any way to verify who they were since information that they provided didn't match up with any driver's license or official ID cards that were issued. And that getting that information was the first step in finding out not just who they were, but what they were usually wanted for, which could be for things very, very serious, well beyond the original traffic violation. And in the 1990s, while this was going on, automated fingerprint ID systems were just coming online and they weren't integrated. So if you worked in a place like Santa Monica, where I did, where we had a lot of people coming from out of state because of the type of friendly environment that we had for people that were homeless, very often we would find that we were dealing with someone that may have never been arrested in Santa Monica or California before, but had a very serious arrest record in another state. But those fingerprints were not in a database that was immediately accessible to Santa Monica PD officers or any officers in California. The information may not have been placed in NCIC, so a check with FBI fingerprint records wouldn't reveal who they were. And you really had to learn how to mine someone for information in order to find out who they were, what they were wanted for, and ensure that they would be brought before the courts for whatever type of offense that was.
So, Gary, let me ask you a question. So, because this happened to someone I know, he got pulled. His brother was a bad player, right? And he used to use his name all the time, his younger brother's name. So, nowadays it's great. I drive around. I have an MDT, mobile data terminal. I can pull up and I get, not only you give me the right information, I get a picture of your license or state ID. I can confirm visually, yes, this is you. Well, in the 80s and 90s, not every department had that. So I literally have buddies who had to go to court to get stuff expunged because of their brothers.
Wow. That was a big problem in Santa Monica. We would stop someone for a traffic violation and they would use a brother's name or a sister's name.
Crappy move.
And unfortunately, too many of our officers would take the information down, write it down on the citation, issue the citation under that name, and they would get a thumbprint of the offender and put it on the back of the pink copy, which in California is the department copy of the citation.
Interesting.
And if somebody got arrested when this went to warrant and they were claiming that it wasn't them, that someone had used their name, they knew that you could pull that pink copy of the citation in court. You can have a forensic expert there, a fingerprint expert in court that could get a print right there in court before the judge, do a comparison, and eliminate the person that was in custody as the person that had signed the written promise to appear.
That's awesome.
But it didn't do a lot of good for them, did it? Because they still spent, hours or sometimes even days in jail for a violation they didn't commit.
Brutal.
So, to me, this is a big red flag that we weren't doing our job right. And when this was going on in the 80s and the 90s, I was an officer. I wasn't a supervisor. But I made it a point to work on my investigative skills by positively identifying someone as to who they really were in part to avoid problems like this. And I got good enough at it that I was asked by my supervisors to provide roll call training. And that was my first step in the training environment, to get other officers to realize that getting that print to eliminate somebody after the warrant had been issued, after the person had fled, and you don't know who it is because, again, they may not have been arrested before, or in California, we had at the time what were called retainable and non-retainable offenses. Are you familiar with those? Violations like public intoxication, misdemeanor violations of one kind or another. I don't think petty theft was one, because at the time, petty theft with a prior conviction for same could result in a felony filing. But I believe misdemeanor vandalism and other misdemeanor violations, even DUI, I think, was considered a non-retainable offense. So the record of the arrest, the fingerprint records of the arrest, might be held by the county, but it wouldn't necessarily go to the state, which is the CII database in California. And it would never go to the FBI and the NCIC database.
Wow.
So if someone were, say, arrested for a non-retainable offense like public intoxication in Massachusetts, for instance, they would have their prints on file there. But if they were wanted for something serious in California, and I ran into a situation like this involving someone from Massachusetts during this time period, we could run their prints and we wouldn't come up with anything. There wouldn't be a hit because the FBI wouldn't have their prints in the automated database, and we wouldn't have them in California since they hadn't been arrested before. So let me give you an example of this thing that happened. I was working patrol one night, and I saw a guy cross the street against a don't walk sign or a red light. I don't recall which it was. He looked homeless, disheveled clothing. He had a backpack. He was dirty when I stopped him, strong body odor. So he'd been living on the street for a while. And I asked him for ID, and he was very casual in his response. He said he didn't have any with him, but he'd had a California ID card once. I got the information that he claimed was his in terms of his full name, his date of birth, his social security number. I had him write all these things down if I was able to verify who he was. And I did a check through our dispatch to see if someone with that information had been arrested or had been issued an ID card or driver's license in the state of California. And it came back no hits. There wasn't any record. So I explained to this guy that if I couldn't verify who he was, I was going to have to take him to jail. Because in California at the time, and I believe it still applies in California and in most states, if you can't verify who you are, there's no mandate that you issue a written promise for someone to appear and release them on that citation. You can take him to jail. The bail may be very low, but it gives you the opportunity to book him, to get their fingerprints, and again, to see what you can find as far as a record of an arrest. In this case, the guy provided me the information. There was no record of who he was. I told him he'd be going to jail, and he didn't want to go there because I explained to him that I could request from the court what's called a bail deviation, where someone's arrested for a rather low priority type of a crime, but you believe they're wanted for something more serious. You can go to the court and you can ask the bail be increased from $25 or $50 up to, and I suggested as a hypothetical, $1 million. And I suggested he may end up staying in jail until we were able to verify his identity. Well, with this, he said that he could prove to me who he was, but unfortunately he didn't have his ID with him. It was locked up in a Greyhound bus terminal that was in Santa Monica. And this was happening at like 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock on a Sunday night, and that terminal was closed. But he held up the key, and he told me he'd be glad to let me have the key if I could get back to the terminal to get into his locker and recover the information that proved his identity and would lead to his release. He also told me that he hadn't been arrested before, and he wanted to cooperate thoroughly. So I arrested him, which was the next step that we take after he can't verify ID. And after that arrest, you know what that leads to next. It enables you to do a search incidental to the arrest of the property that he has on him. And I went through his backpack, and I didn't find any ID, but I did find a couple, three things of interest. The first was a hardcore porn magazine. Generally, that doesn't set off any alarms.
Santa Monica.
But when you find within the pages of that magazine a butcher knife and a newspaper article talking about the relationship between hardcore porn and violence against women, that should make you more interested in who this guy is, and it certainly did to me.
Yeah.
So I brought him back to the police station. We have, after the arrest, 3 hours before you got to book him or release him on a citation. I figure I've got at least a couple, 3 hours to work with if my watch commander doesn't get upset for me spending the time on this. And even though that bus terminal was closed, like a lot of cities, we have an emergency notification file. So I was able to find the manager of that bus terminal, who happened to live in Santa Monica. I gave her a call at home, and I asked her if she'd be willing to open up the terminal so I could use that key to access a locker. The woman was very cooperative. She said she'd be glad to do it, but the terminal was downtown Santa Monica, an area she didn't want to go to on her own at that hour. And, of course, I'm going to accommodate her needs. I drove to her home, picked her up, drove her to the terminal. She opened the terminal up. I got to the bus locker, used the key, pulled out another bag, and in this bag, I found a really interesting letter. Now, remember, he gave me consent to search this locker for what I needed in order to verify his identity so that I could give him a citation, right? That's the carrot to the stick of keeping him in custody. I found a letter, an unmailed letter, with a return address that just said a friend. And the letter was to a place in, I believe it's Chelsea, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
And I was not familiar with Massachusetts at all, but there was a name on the letter, an apartment. And when I opened this letter up and read it, it said, in effect, "Dear Dad, I'm sorry for bringing all this shame and trouble on the family. I didn't do what they said I'd do, but I promise this will all be worked out soon, and I'll be able to come home. Until then, know I'm okay. I'll be in touch periodically. Love," and a scribble that I couldn't read. So with this information, I contacted the PD in Chelsea. And I'm sorry, not Chelsea. Quincy is the name of this town. I contacted the PD. I told them what I had. I gave them the name that the subject had given me, along with the date of birth and the social security number. They couldn't find a record, but they did comply with my request to go to the address and try and make contact. And in the meantime, I did everything I could using our online resources, our computer resources, to find out who this guy was. And ultimately, I wasn't able to identify him. The officer from Quincy went to the location, called me back, and said it was a public housing location. And he rang the buzzer to wake up the resident there. And I guess 3 hours ahead, it probably would have been 3 or 4 in the morning. Nobody answered. And at this point, it had been 2 hours, 2.5 hours. And my watch commander called me in the office and said, Gary, what are you doing with this guy? He's in custody for jaywalking. And you got to book him now or let him go. And he's complaining about some type of physical issues. So before you book him, you'd have to get an approval to book by a doctor. Mm-hmm. And we just don't want to spend that type of time and trouble. So I'm ordering you to take him to the hospital, release him on the citation for the violation that you got. So you can imagine how much I hated doing that.
Right.
But I did. I mean, it was a lawful order. I took him there, I released him, and on the back of that citation, from top to bottom, I wrote notes about everything that had happened. The blocker number, the name of the woman that opened up Greyhound bus terminal, the name of the officers at the scene, the letter, the address on the letter, everything. Because as you know, if you don't document it, it didn't occur, right?
Right.
So I was really thorough about that. I released the guy, and several months later, I want to say it was about 4 months later, I'm sitting at roll call, and my supervisor says, don't worry about this. The chief thinks he's a nut, and he gives me a piece of paper that is a letter written from a custody facility in Massachusetts, and it's addressed to the chief of police in Santa Monica. And it says, Dear Chief, I'm in jail for something I didn't do. Several months ago, one of your officers, Gary Steiner, wrote me this ticket, and here's a photocopy of the citation. I didn't give him my real name, but I did give him permission to go into the bus locker. And within that locker, there were some photographs showing I was in one town when I'm accused of being somewhere else and committing a terrible crime. Would you please ask Officer Steiner to get those photographs and send them back to me, because they weren't there when I went into the locker later. Send me back these photographs so I can prove my innocence. He can send them to my attorney, and the attorney's name is listed, and address and phone number, or the prosecutor. And he gave the prosecutor's name and her phone number. Thank you very much. Signed, and then this guy's real name. Well, of course, I'm not going to waste any time in not calling the prosecutor and finding out what's up with this. And this is what I found out. About 3 or 4 weeks before I had stopped this subject, there had been an attempted kidnap of a young boy in the area of Quincy. And the boy was able to fight off the guy that tried pulling him into the car. He didn't get a license number, but he gave a pretty good description of the incident. And a week or two after that, a young girl, I think she was about 4 or 5 years old, was kidnapped off the street and sexually assaulted. This girl provided information also, but didn't have a license plate number. But between the two incidents, there was enough information that investigators formed the belief that the subject that I had stopped could have been the suspect. And they went to do an interview. They didn't get enough information from him at his home to make an arrest. And this predates DNA. But one of the things that interested them was that they wanted to look at his car, the car that was registered to him, and get some photographs of it to show the victims. And between the time of the last incident and the time they went to the scene, he'd taken the car to a salvage yard and had it scrapped. So the car wasn't available. And these things they thought were certainly enough to raise their concerns that they had the right guy. But they didn't want to they didn't feel they had enough probable cause at the time, and they wanted to take this to the prosecutors for the filing. While they were doing that, according to the prosecutor, they didn't have any evidence showing a consciousness of guilt until I contacted them and related this incident and sent them photocopies of the citation that I'd issued and all the notes on the back of it. Why would somebody lie about who he was and leave I guess it's in the Boston area, Quincy?
Yeah, just south.
Leave the Boston area to go to turned out they arrested him at a Fleabag hotel in West Hollywood at a payphone where he'd been calling his family and girlfriends occasionally. They were able to determine he was making these calls, contact I believe it was Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and or the U.S. Marshal Service, and arrest him at this payphone while he was making one of the calls. And what he told them was that he just decided to go west to find work, and that his leaving Massachusetts for California had nothing to do with the fact that he was under investigation for attempted kidnapping and child molestation. So what do we have for evidence showing a consciousness of guilt? Well, why is he lying to me about who he is, right?
Yeah.
Think about the letter that he wrote that I copied. And now, does that show a consciousness of guilt? Does that indicate flight? Well, the prosecutor sure believed it did. And even though they had a case filed based upon the fact he fled to the West Coast, what happened between us during that pedestrian stop and subsequent arrest really assisted their case. And I thought I was going to get my first paid junket to Massachusetts. But it ended up he took a 50-year plus sentence instead. So what did I learn from this incident? Well, I knew I was on the right track in terms of corroborating people's IDs and using the investigative technique of a carrot, citation and freedom, and a stick, going to jail possibly for weeks, as a means of getting that information. And it was very useful, but it wasn't until about 3 or 4 years when I attended a class that our department sent me to called Homicide Investigation for the Patrol Officer, that I really learned how to conduct solid interviews and interrogations using a technique called behavioral analysis. And that was because 8 hours, one day of this 2 or 3 day class was devoted to training provided by an organization called John Reed and Associates. And what they do is they teach you to use things like verbal timing, strength, word choice, and body language to assess what someone is saying, and then to use behaviors on your part in order to elicit statements from them that are credible, and to show those statements are credible by obtaining independent corroboration during that interview and avoiding things like contamination issues, where you give them information that is much better provided by the offender to you, clean, rather than just parroting what you've told them.
Gary, you get a guy in custody and you're going to question him. Just for the cops out there that are listening, and we've all had the guy that you're going to question, and you know damn well he did it. You know he's guilty. You know, but you need to have this interview. You need a lot more to satisfy the courts. So when you sit down with them, how do you make someone? How do they train you to have somebody trust you?
Well, trust is a huge issue, right? And
especially when you're like borderline pissed off because you know they did it.
Well, okay, all right. Let's hit on that real quick, and then we'll go to the house. But first, I want to hit on our knowledge of whether or not someone did. Let me ask you something, Steve. You ever arrested a factually innocent person for a crime they didn't commit?
A factually innocent person?
In other words, they didn't do it. They just flat didn't do it.
I've not, no.
You know what? I bet you have. But you didn't know it. And I'll be the first to admit, I did. I did it as a detective. I did it as a patrol officer. And I've seen other officers do it. And part of the problem, and being a cop and questioning people using techniques that other guys that haven't had formal training just kind of picked up on their own use, part of the problem is you run into a thing called confirmation bias, where everything and tell me you haven't heard this before. How do you tell someone's lying when you're interviewing a bad guy? Their lips are moving, right?
Yeah.
Have you heard that?
Yeah.
Okay, it's a common saying. But I'll tell you this, we do deal with people that we think have committed the crime and they didn't. And one of the wonderful things about using this training, and I mean really using the training, is that it helps you step away from that feeling, that belief that you're hoping you can reinforce with information they give you, and using techniques that are going to test the subject that you're interviewing or interrogating, and they're going to be able to confirm to you whether or not you got the right guy or the wrong guy. Look, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here as far as criminal law, but I think most cops, and I hope most people in the audience, recognize that you need a lot less proof to make an arrest based on probable cause versus taking someone to trial and getting a conviction, right? For probable cause, suspicions based upon circumstances that you have that would lead an officer with your level of experience and training to believe that this person committed the crime you want to arrest them for, right? What do you need in order to get a conviction? You need proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a much higher standard, isn't it? Well, the reason that we're able to make arrests with a lower level of evidence is so that we can conduct an investigation that's going to raise the amount of evidence against the person we believe committed the offense to a level where a jury can, or judge, can convict based upon proof beyond reasonable doubt, or this is the flip side to it, or you learn as a police officer enough about this person and the crime that you believe you got the wrong guy, and now you've got the opportunity to release them and redirect your investigation. All these things that I mentioned, the verbal timing, the strength, the word choices, the body language, have two sides. Look at them as being coins. On one side, these behaviors are going to indicate, once you learn them and you're looking for them, you're not just listening to what the person has to say. You're looking at how they're saying it. Again, the timing, the strength of what they say, what kind of words they choose in their body language. And you want to see if in this stressful encounter, which is what an interrogation is, and just for those that don't know, and I know even a lot of cops don't know the difference between an interview and an interrogation. An interview is simply questioning someone to get information. It is not confrontational, and generally they're not accusatory. An interrogation, you've got somebody in custody usually for this violation. It's accusatory. It's a much higher stressful environment for the person being questioned, and you're going to use certain techniques that are much more intrusive than you use doing a simple interview. I mean, you've done interviews as a background investigator, right?
Sure.
And when you conduct an interview as a background investigator, you're not generally accusing people of committing crimes. You're trying to get information from someone that's cooperating with you because they want a job. And in my experience, it isn't very often a background investigator has to admonish someone regarding Miranda and warn them that, maybe this isn't the time to be talking to cops without an attorney present. And if you want an attorney and you can't afford them, you can have one appointed by the court. An interrogation, again, it's accusational and it's very confrontational. So, all right, you got a guy in custody for a violation you believe he committed. And I'm going to give you the first case that I had using these techniques. See, does that come in? I don't know if you can see it or am I frozen here?
Oh, you froze.
Can you hear me okay?
There I can see it.
Okay, my face froze. All right. So one of the things that we're fortunate enough to get after this 8-hour class is we can buy the book called Criminal Interrogation and Confessions, and they're probably in about the 20th printing. I don't know how many. But it's written by John E. Reed, who's passed away, but he was the founder of this organization. Joseph Buckley, who I believe is still alive, and I actually had the pleasure of talking to him regarding a case I investigated, and another author by the name of Fred Imbaugh. And this book lays out the techniques that you use, the order you use these techniques, and the things that you're looking for that can differentiate between someone that is lying to you or providing you information that indicates that there's some deception going on, and someone that is, according to these behaviors, giving you information which should be more credible and reliable. And I had an incident that occurred the day my book arrived in the mail. I was working night watch, and I'd had this class about 2 weeks earlier, and they shipped the book out to me, and it arrived around noon, and I had some time to refresh my memory with these techniques by going through the book before I had to be at work for a 5 o'clock roll call. And one of the first calls that I got was a suspicious persons call, and it involved 3 young men. They were all minors, 16, 17 years old. And a witness had seen them hanging around in front of his apartment building. And one of these subjects removed what looked like a .45 automatic from his waistband, and he put it in the planter. And obviously that's going to be something of concern. So when we arrived, we detained these 3 guys, did a search of the planter, and we found one of these really cheap marksman BB guns. That it's a pistol that looks a lot like a .45, and it's probably been used in more armed robberies than any other single object, because they sold at the time, I think, for about $5.
Right.
And these kids admitted that the gun was theirs, the BB gun was theirs, and said they were just playing around with it, and they were waiting for an acquaintance that was in the apartment complex that lived there to come out and visit. And while we were talking to them, we were completing field interview cards. And a citizen came up to me who lived in the neighborhood, and he said, "Hey, I just want to tell you, a couple of weeks ago, a friend of mine and his wife were down the street when they were accosted by 3 guys that kind of matched their description, height, sex, age, race, not wearing the same clothes. But again, it was just a couple of weeks earlier, and they were robbed at gunpoint. And my friend said they had a .45 automatic, and my friend was beaten with that gun." So it's a pretty serious violation. Now, these are minors. And in California, if you arrest a minor, and I don't think this has changed, You don't take them to big boy jail to stay. You might book them in your local jail, but they're going to go to juvenile hall. Once they go to juvenile hall, it takes a lot for them to stay there. Generally speaking, they're released to their parents from that location.
Right.
I knew at the time that I was detaining these kids that I didn't have enough information there to file a case of them. We couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt they committed this crime. We didn't have any evidence to that degree. But as a police officer, looking at the totality of what we had, did I have sufficient probable cause to make an arrest and conduct a further investigation? Absolutely. Now, in a lot of police departments, and this is how it was in Santa Monica, if you arrested a minor for a felony during the daytime, no problem getting an investigator to do an interview and interrogation. But what if you arrested them outside of the 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. hours, weekdays, when a detective was available? Are they going to call in a detective to interview these kids? No. So we could make an arrest based on probable cause. But if they went to juvenile hall, they're going to be released to a parent. Nobody's going to be able to do an interrogation, right? Well, even though patrol officers were generally prohibited from interrogating someone arrested for a felony, there were exceptions. And one of those exceptions was if you had a minor that was arrested outside business hours, and that minor was subsequently going to be either taken to juvenile hall or released. So I'd had 8 hours of training using behavioral analysis, and I had maybe 3 hours of review that afternoon before I came to work of reading this book. And I decided, what the heck? What do I got to lose by following up on it? So we arrested these 3 subjects. Only 3 of them matched the descriptions of the ones that were involved in the crime. We brought them to the station. I conducted an interrogation using these techniques. And again, it's confrontational and it's accusatory, these specific techniques. You want to instill a sense of fear of consequences in the people that you're interrogating. And you also want them to trust you insofar as they believe you're a professional, you know what you're doing, and when you tell them that you know they were involved in this incident, that they believe you. Now, that's going to result in a psychological response, right? If I'd said, Steve Gould, I knew you committed this robbery, and I brought you in and you didn't commit the robbery, you're going to behave in certain ways that are going to be different from someone that I make that same kind of accusation to, and they did commit the crime. Because right. What have you got instilled? You've got that sense of trust. If Steve Gould trusts that I'm an honest cop, I'm a hardworking cop, but in this case I'm wrong, what's he going to say to me? 90+% of the time, an innocent person's going to say, I didn't do it. What do I have to do to prove to you that I didn't do it? And that's a really important component to determining you've got a factually innocent subject that you can release. So I did confrontations with 3 of these subjects over a period of about an hour. One of them was displaying the types of behaviors associated with innocence. I put him off to the side. The second one was displaying behaviors associated with concealing participation in something they didn't want me to know about. And I couldn't get them to take that extra step, but I still had a third guy that I wanted to interview. And remember, I've got, 3 hours to do this stuff, right? Before they have to be booked. The third guy was showing absolute signs of behaviors associated with guilt. And I did some things that I hadn't done previously as a police officer before. When you go through the academy, and what do they teach you about getting close to someone that you're interrogating or interviewing, even out on the street?
Danger.
I know when I went through the academy, you got to keep some distance, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to get close enough that they can punch you, right?
Bladed stance. You got some distance from them.
Absolutely, which is great as far as safety, but it's terrible in terms of getting information from someone. So now I've had the opportunity to search him. We're in an interview room, and there's nothing between us but air and about 4 feet of space. He's in a chair, I'm in a chair. And as I'm conducting this interview, I'm moving closer to him. So we've got this proximity issue going on, which is making him even less comfortable with the fact that he's being accused of a serious crime. And now I had to do something for the first time I'd never done as a cop before. And that is, I had to put my arm around this guy's shoulder and say to him that, yeah, you know what? I was 17 once too. I know what it's like to have peer pressure. And I know how important it is to have the respect to your buddies. I would probably have ended up doing the same thing you did if I'm in your situation. So what am I doing now? I'm relating to this guy, and I'm giving him a psychological out. And that's when the waterworks came on. He started to cry. He looked up at me, and he said, "They made me do it." And I said, "Tell me about it. How'd that happen? Because I believe you." And I patted him on the shoulder. And he told me how he'd been out with 2 friends. One was the other guy that was sitting in custody. But that guy didn't do anything directly. He was just there. And he had another friend that told him, "We got to jack this couple that we see down the street." And he described the couple that had been victimized. He described how he pulled this BB gun out of his waistband and threatened them with it to get the guy's wallet and the woman's purse. And how he felt he didn't have any choice but to pistol whip the man because otherwise he wouldn't look good in front of his friends. Oh. Now, it's great that he's saying this stuff, but what's the next step, right? Remember what I was saying about corroboration? And I established this degree of trust with the guy. I said, you know what? If you really want me to believe you didn't have any choice, that you were bullied into doing this, let's do the right thing and get their property back to them. And he nodded and he told me how they were in the trash can behind his house. And then he gave me written consent to go there and collect that evidence.
Awesome.
So if you haven't gotten it yet, this is one of the things that sold me on behavioral analysis-based interview interrogation. It was literally the first day that I used it.
That must have been exciting.
Oh, I loved it. I was to the moon. And I literally did this thousands of times. But it's retiring as a resource, an investigative and as an expert resource for the defense. Because remember, you got 2 sides of the coin here. And there are times that you interview people. And unfortunately, or fortunately, actually, I think it's a good thing. When I was working as a detective, which happened, how long after that? About 2 years, I think, after that. No, it might have been even less than that. But as a detective, I use these same techniques to get information that was reliable from those that I was questioning that were accused of crimes. In some cases, they didn't commit. And you know what? As thrilled as I was to get that kid to cop out to doing the robbery and assault with a deadly weapon, I got to tell you, it is every bit as rewarding when you talk to someone that claims that they didn't commit a crime, and then you find out that's true, and you exonerate them and move on and find the right guy and hold that offender responsible for what they did.
I bet. Yeah, absolutely. How long after this interview and you taking this class must have helped to get you into investigations as an assignment?
Well, it did. I had been applying to be a detective for a while. I think we talked about this in review. The chief of police says to be a detective. Somehow my name didn't remain at the top of the list until 8 years later. After that chief had left, the new chief came in, and that was
right.
I was transferred to detective 6 months after that.
So, Gary, we had a connection issue, but we're back. So I'd asked about, that class kind of catapulting you into investigations, and you were starting to answer. And you reminded me that from our first interview of the onboarding process you had at Santa Monica PD, so possibly that chief would not have been the biggest Gary Steiner fan, which is a sin in my world.
Well, the thing is, in our department, regardless of my issues with the chief, Lloyd, while you're working patrol. And although my having to fight the chief as far as getting hired was an issue, and because of that, I didn't promote for 8 years to detectives. Within 6 months of him retiring and the new chief coming in, I guess I demonstrated my abilities and had a good enough reputation that the new chief decided I had to go up to detectives, and I did so.
That was such an interesting part of your story, how you basically, begrudgingly had to get onto the department, which was phenomenal. I mean, a lot of people, your first interview, loved it. They loved the perseverance and all the stuff you had to go through, and how you wouldn't stop, and you were just determined to make this happen. And what a career you had. It's so cool. And it's kind of hard to believe that someone, would hold that against you. But, as we all know, sometimes when you're the top cat, you have your own ideas of grandeur,
Yeah, that's true. But I also believe that, and I hope that the personality traits that I demonstrate are more the norm than not the norm. Because if you're going to be a cop at all, especially the way things are today, you got to have perseverance. You just cannot quit. And I don't know what the type of pressure people have these days, not just from those that have a monetary stake in demeaning the police, like some attorneys do, certain attorneys involved in politics, and I'm not even talking about criminal defense attorneys, but attorneys that are looking to do other things with their careers, going into public policy. I just gotta take a step back and say that anybody that stays as a police officer today and puts up with the crap that these kids, and I know they're not really kids, but these kids that are doing the job these days are doing, have got to put up with. My heart's out to them. It's so incredibly difficult to serve in that kind of an environment and do the things you need to do in order to meet the expectations, some of which are absolutely unrealistic, of the public. It's tough. It's very tough. But
can you imagine, Gary, these expectations now put on you policing in Santa Monica in the late 80s, early 90s? Because Gary and I, people don't know this is a little inside baseball, but Gary and I communicate once in a while through email and chatting, and just kind of a lot of times just setting up if he could come on again and whatever. And in one of our back and forth, Gary was like, well, we were talking about firearms and stuff, and you said, well, I had 3 officer-involved shootings. And I went, whoa, 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 whoa. What are you talking about? Your officer-involved shootings. We haven't talked about this on the podcast. What's going on? And you were kind of like, well, Santa Monica back in the day was just kind of, there was so many shootings that it didn't exactly come to the forefront of your mind. And that's kind of the way it was in New York City and LA also. It was just there's a lot more shoot 'em ups back then.
Well, I'm convinced in the 70s and 80s, we actually had a lot more violence going on than in the roaring 20s.
Yeah.
And I mean, the things that were done by criminals like Dillinger or Bonnie and Clyde, how often do you see crimes like those being committed nowadays in the United States? And I don't want to say they're the norm, but they certainly aren't as exceptional as they were back then. People just weren't as apt to commit violent crime in the 1920s as they are today. And I think a lot of that has to do because people are convinced that it's okay, that they have excuses to commit antisocial acts. And unfortunately today, there is a blurred line between being famous and infamous. And I think that says a lot about what society is today and how it's rolling down a real steep grade to something that isn't civil.
Yeah. It's pretty freaky.
It's pretty freaky.
Can you take us to? We're almost going on. We're almost at an hour here, as we always roll high when I'm interviewing you because we get carried away.
Oh gosh!
Can you tell us about one of your officer-involved shootings? I think you sent me some newspaper clippings, and pretty favorable remarks by the chief of police. Was that the guy? Same guy?
The new chief. That
Okay.
was the chief that promoted me to detectives, put me in detectives, and subsequently promoted me to sergeant.
That was the carjacking one I read about.
That was the last one. That was in February 2006. Let me do it and kind of tell you how that blends in with what we're talking about here as far as being a good interrogator.
Yeah, please.
I don't know if you picked up on this or not, but one of the things I got most out of my training, and again, John Reed and Associates, a great organization, Behavioral Analysis Training Institute, which is a California-based behavioral analysis-based training organization on interviews and interrogations, and Interrogation Institute. All three of those are excellent resources, and I highly recommend that police officers, and don't wait until you're a detective to do it. Police officers need this training at the beginning of their career, not after they've been a cop for 5 or 6 years and think they know it all. They need to learn this while they're in uniform, and they need to practice these techniques and hone their expertise while they're in patrol. It's absolutely essential. The supervisors that I've talked to in LAPD, the Sheriff's Department, many other agencies, they believe, as I do, that if you go to one of these classes, and some of these classes are 40 hours in length,
wow,
that if you go to one of these classes, after being assigned as a detective and with 4 or 5 or 8 or 10 years experience in patrol, that chances are you're not going to use these techniques. You're going to do what you did before. And it's not a good thing. In my experience, about 10% of the people that take these classes go out and really use these techniques. And that's a terrible number. And I believe that it's because of this that you have situations that come up where you have unreliable confession evidence that later turns out to involve factually innocent defendants wrongly convicted. And it hurts not just the image of the police department, but the budget of the police department with civil settlements that are made.
Sure.
And what happens, when they have less money, they have less training. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I would suggest to any chief of a law enforcement agency that if you want to increase the reliability of your investigators' training, that you will have your police officers, as soon as they are sworn, if not while in the academy, get this training, and you want to have supervision and ensure they use it. So with that said, one of the things that you're trained to appreciate, to develop, and to use on a daily basis is empathy. And I don't think that there's any place I've ever taken a class in law enforcement or anywhere else. Well, let me go back a bit. Yeah, there's one place where I was trained to use empathy as a professional technique to get information from people. And that was when I attended the capital case conference put on by the California State Public Defender's Office. And even though you have defense attorneys that put down behavioral analysis-based interview and interrogation training that police receive, guess what? They provide the same training to private investigators that work for the defense. So again, if you want to develop best as a police officer, you need to develop that sense of empathy. And that'll make you a better investigator, it'll make you a better interrogator, it'll make you a better interviewer, and it'll make you a better cop. So where does that come in when it involves a officer involved use of deadly force?
Tie it all in.
Okay. I'd say this happened in 2006, but it actually started from my perspective earlier than that. When the North Hollywood shooting went down.
Oh, yeah, that's a huge
one. And I believe that was about 1998. That seem about right to you? So we just had the 20-year anniversary, so it would have been 19... oh, gosh.
Yeah, definitely the 90s. I mean, I remember seeing it, and then they played it again in my police academy in the early 2000s. Must have been the 90s at some point. All right.
Well, the North Hollywood shooting, I had actually left a task force called TRAP. It was an auto theft investigation task force. I'd left TRAP.
I work with some guys at backgrounds at homicide.
We're going to have to talk about that after this is over. Because a couple of people that I worked with in TRAP, one of whom was my replacements from Santa Monica PD, were involved in the North Hollywood shootout. And I was working robbery homicide at the time that occurred, or I was assigned to robbery homicide. And when the incident occurred, I was actually on vacation with my wife in Hawaii. And she woke me up from a stupor because I developed pneumonia and wasn't feeling so well. But she woke me up to see what was going on TV, and I watched that live as it was going on. And most police officers that I know try to learn from other police officers' experiences, both good and bad.
Sure.
And one of the things that concerned me watching the incident unfold and reading about what had happened afterwards and talking to some people that I knew that were involved in it is that the aftermath involving one of those suspects, I believe it was Sereno, that was shot in the legs by the SWAT officers. And the fact that he was, in effect, allowed to bleed to death at the scene.
Right.
It was 45 minutes before paramedics reached his location. And I think either shortly after they arrived or shortly after they transported him to the hospital, he died from blood loss. And he received what would have been survivable wounds. Now, I understand, and again, it's a sense of empathy. I understand why the family filed a lawsuit against the city of Los Angeles. And I understand why the jurors in that civil case found for the people rather than the plaintiff, which was Montessoreno's family, on the charges that it was a wrongful death. That said, it bothered me a lot from the standpoint of being a law enforcement professional that he wasn't transported sooner. And I know there were things said about, well, maybe he had a bomb on him, or, that the paramedics were tied up dealing with injured officers and innocent victims, but it still concerned me. And I kept that in mind, even to the point when I became a supervisor, and I trained our officers on a regular basis about things like use of deadly force and responsibility to care for those that we had in our custody. So have that in mind when you hear what happened in this. In February of 2006, I was working morning watch as one of two sergeants that were assigned. And we had a carjacking that occurred where someone in a van rear-ended someone driving I believe it was a two-door convertible, creating enough damage that the other subject stopped and got out of the car or rolled down his window believing they were going to exchange information. What that victim didn't know is that the person that had rammed him was driving a van that was taken a couple days earlier in a carjacking. And when the driver of that van approached the other car and pointed a stolen Remington 870 12-gauge shotgun at the driver, he decided, I probably ought to get out of the car. So that victim got out of his car. The offender got in the convertible, drove off, and within a very short period of time, I don't know if the victim had a cell phone or what. He probably had a cell phone, but within a very short period of time, the victim reported the carjacking description of the vehicle and its direction of travel, which was southbound on Lincoln Boulevard, which is a very major street that travels north-south in Santa Monica and exits on our South City limits into Venice. And it just so happened that Venice, which is LAPD Pacific Division, is where the van had been taken a couple days earlier. So when this information was broadcast, a couple of our officers overheard the transmission. They started driving south on Lincoln, and sure enough, they spotted the vehicle. They engaged in a pursuit. They left the city limits, went just a couple blocks into Venice, where the driver of the stolen car stopped, got out with a shotgun, and opened fire on their vehicle. Ooh. He didn't hit either of the officers, but neither was able to return fire at that point. Both ducked down out of the line of fire and escaped injury, while the suspect got back into the stolen vehicle, back into the police car, pursuit for another couple blocks, and the pursuit terminated when the suspect lost control of his car and hit a heavy concrete light pole. At this point, the two officers stopped their car, took cover behind it, and the suspect got out of his vehicle again, opened fire on them a second time, and they returned fire with their handguns. The suspect appeared to one of them that he may have taken a hit, and he got back into the stolen car, which was disabled. And over the next few minutes, several other officers arrived at the location. Another sergeant and myself arrived at the location. And while we were attempting to get the suspect to surrender, we'd set up a perimeter, and within, I'd say 10 minutes or less, the suspect decided that he didn't want to give up. He exited the car a third time with a shotgun and engaged the officers that were present, and 6 of us fired on him, myself and 5 officers. 3 of us were armed with AR-15 patrol rifles.
Oh, wow.
And 3 of us were armed with handguns. And he was struck a total of 3 times with a handgun rounds and 9 times with .223 caliber rounds from the AR-15s. Unlike TV, he wasn't flown off to the side by the power of the bullets. He didn't drop at the scene. What he did was re-enter the car and sat down in the seat with the gun in hand. And we were placed in a position where we could wait for 45 minutes to an hour for our K-9 to arrive and a SWAT team, or we could approach the vehicle ourselves using the resources we had. Senior sergeant at the scene, I was put in a position that I believe supervisors in the LAPD situation were put on. And I had to make a decision. Are we going to let somebody else show up in 45 minutes to an hour? Or are we going to treat this guy as a severely injured or possibly dead offender that we had a responsibility for? And it was my belief that we had a legal, moral, and ethical obligation to approach the car at this point rather than wait for someone else to do it and assess the suspect's injuries. If he wanted to re-engage us and was killed at the time, no, that was the risk he'd have to take. If he was seriously wounded and medical aid could have saved his life, then I felt, and I still feel, that we had an obligation to fulfill. And I told that to the officers present. We approached the vehicle. We took one of those present. The other sergeant took the shotgun out of the offender's hands. He was unconscious. And when we assessed him, it turned out that he was deceased at the scene. But to get back to how this ties in with development of empathy, I think it would have been much easier if I hadn't worked on empathy as a component of what I did for work, to just say, well, we're going to sit back and wait for somebody else to come in and handle it. Even though there wasn't anything we could do to ensure this guy's survival, I still feel good about what we did, to the point where I don't have any feelings of remorse regarding the incident itself. And I know that there are others that have been involved in use of force incidents where they've experienced things like PTSD. But at least in my case, I think that doing what we had to do as far as employing that deadly force wasn't any different than doing what we had to do in terms of providing aid if that was necessary. And I'm very comfortable with the results of the incident.
Yeah, you should be. I mean, that's I think to most people, common sense thinking people, when they hear that, what you just described, that's like above and beyond. Like that truly is. And rightfully so, people expect that of police to do the right thing and then some. And that's what you did. 85% of the population would have been fine with just leaving the guy there. Been like, well, hey, that's justice. This guy earned what he got, but you did the absolute right thing and moved in at risk of yourself, that.
Well, again, I believe that what we did as a team at the end of the incident, going up and assessing him, was what was required rather than above and beyond. Now, I wrote those first two officers up, and they subsequently received our department's Medal of Valor, because I believe that their actions confronting the suspect and engaging him 3 times, the first 2 times while they were alone, met the standard of above and beyond. And they were subsequently awarded our Medal of Valor.
Absolutely.
I didn't feel that going up after the incident had concluded and checking the status of the suspect rose to that level, but I'm just glad the way things worked out. I felt very comfortable with how it ended. I know that the night that it occurred, or sometime shortly afterwards, that there was an officer that was involved that, he took the taking of a human life to heart, and it bothered him. And I understand that. He didn't think that there was anything at all making this an unreasonable use of deadly force. But again, I think that developing and refining a greater sense of empathy is a benefit that formal interview and interrogation training provides that any other class as a law enforcement professional. And I think it's another reason why cops ought to get this type of training early in their career rather than later. Now, that was in 2006. 2 years later, I retired from Santa Monica PD. And after retiring, I felt, being in my mid-50s, I still had things that I could offer in terms of using my experience and training for a greater good. And part of that was training other police officers as well as citizens. I've trained law students, and I've trained lawyers, mostly defense attorneys, in best practices and behavioral analysis-based interview and interrogation
defense
techniques.
Attorneys, Gary, what are you doing?
I'll tell you what, I've had over 100 appointments as an expert on confession evidence. And I touched on this before, and I got to tell you, Steve, if you think that you can get satisfaction from getting someone, and I've had murderers provide me with admissions of guilt, child molesters, rapists, some really horrible people admitting that they committed some terrible crimes against innocent victims. If you think that that is rewarding, I have no doubt in my mind whatsoever that you would feel just as good if you were able to exonerate someone that was accused of committing a serious crime like that, but in fact had not committed it.
That's right. Absolutely.
It is every bit our job to exonerate the innocent as it is to ensure that the offender is convicted. Every bit our responsibility. But if you don't get this training, you can't do that. And I was telling you the truth, that there were cases I was involved in as a detective, as a police officer, and subsequently as a defense resource, where I was dealing with factually innocent people that were wrongly accused. And it isn't because cops are out there just to frame anyone. Barry Scheck is the founder of the Innocence Project. And again, one of the advantages I had to being a defense resource is that I attended training that was provided by people like Barry Scheck, and Barry Scheck in particular, at venues like the Capital Case Conference, where Scheck admits that the vast majority of cases involving factually innocent defendants wrongly convicted, those cases involved cops that believed the person they were dealing with had committed the crime. And a lot of those cases involved situations where the confession wasn't even what you or others listening to this might think was a coerced confession. It wasn't something the police got out of the accused. It was something the court and the attorneys got out of the accused. In other words, you had someone that was accused of a crime, and there was evidence that was present, and there was an offer made by the prosecution that if the accused would plead guilty or nolo, that they would get a lesser penalty than if the case went to trial and they were convicted. And I got to tell you, if a defense attorney tells someone, we're going to win this, don't worry, we're going to win this, and he's wrong, it isn't the defense attorney that goes to prison.
Right.
It's the accused that goes to prison. And no ethical defense attorney is going to promise his defendant that he's going to win a case. You just can't do it. Mm. The best a defense attorney, a good defense attorney, and I've worked with some very good defense attorneys, can do is say, this is what the offer is. This is what we're looking at. I can do these things for you, but I can't promise you the outcome that you're hoping. And unfortunately, the media, and to a degree, even the Innocence Project, allows the public to believe that many of these exonerations that occur through DNA and other evidence involving confession evidence involve confessions that are obtained by the police. They aren't. They involve admissions that occur in the court based upon plea offers. And in some cases, the police haven't even interviewed or interrogated the accused.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, but everybody thinks, well, gosh, the cops must have forced a confession from someone, and that's just simply not the case.
Of course, but it's the cops.
I've worked a number. Well,
that's where they always go.
Responsibility for investigating, but did you know that in California, and this is an important investigative tool that's used in many states. In California, an investigator might be dealing with someone that is alleging that they were victimized. And if that person saying that they were the victim of an armed robbery, and the police officer says, as an investigative technique, if you took a polygraph exam, what do you think that would show? And I can tell you that that question has very often resulted in people that have falsely reported crimes to admit that the incident really didn't occur. But that if you ask that same question involving someone that's alleging that she was the victim of a sexual assault, you know that in California that officer would be committing a crime just by asking if the alleged victim would be willing to take a polygraph exam.
Really?
You know, yeah. So you have a situation like what occurred with the young man in Long Beach that went to prison for 6 years for sexual assault on a woman on, I believe it was Cal State Long Beach grounds. And the assault never occurred. The investigators conducted an interview, but they're prohibited from even asking the alleged victim bait questions like that as far as polygraph exam. And this young man who had a promising football career was given an opportunity to plead guilty to a crime he didn't commit or to take it to trial and risk going to prison for decades. He pled guilty, and it wasn't until he got out 6 years, 8 years later that the young woman in question approached him and admitted on tape that the only reason that she'd done this is because she was pressured into making the accusation by her mother.
And now he's going to be guilty of murder.
If he'd been charged with murder, I don't think he's been charged with anything since he got out of prison. And in fact, the courts subsequently dismissed his conviction. But think about this: if he'd been charged with murder, if he'd been charged with armed robbery, the investigators in this situation, if they'd had the training, they could have used at least the technique to ask the victim, if you took a polygraph exam, what do you think it would show? And then see how she responded, and even asked her to take a poly. In California, because 20 years ago, there was so much concern regarding the victim's right to avoid accusals by the defense of making up charges of sexual assault. Police officers in that state can't even ask the question about taking a polygraph exam in a sexual assault case, where they could if it was a murder, if it was a robbery, if it was a grand theft.
Makes no sense.
And personally, I had a situation as a detective where I arrested a young man for auto theft. And the next day, the subject's mother came in, and she wanted to take the blame for the stolen car that her son was driving, which was VIN switched. And it just so happened that it was on a weekend, and we had a polygraph examiner that was doing pre-employment polys for our department, who was doing that as a part-time gig. His full-time gig was doing it for LAPD, and you'd probably know this polygraph examiner if he was still around when you were doing backgrounds. And he had the polygraph on the table in the interview room where I was talking with this woman who was saying that her son didn't steal the car. He had nothing to do with the VIN switch, that this was all on her. She wanted him released. She was willing to take the blame. And using some of these behavioral analysis techniques over a period of about 30, 45 minutes, I asked the woman if she noticed this machine that was on the table in front of us. And she acted like, oh, gosh, no, I hadn't even noticed it. Well, it's a polygraph device. If you were to take that right now, take that test right now, what do you think it would show me? And she started shaking and started crying. She says it would say I was lying. I didn't have anything to do with the car. I just want to help my son out.
Yeah, of course.
So, I was able to clear that up and find the truth within an hour. And again, it's a great tool, but if you're going to utilize best practices, you need the tool of behavioral analysis-based interview and interrogation. You absolutely have to have it.
But you have me sold, Gary. I'm gonna, like I said, like we chatted before, that Reed and Associates you're talking about, that does come up a couple times a year in New England. So I would absolutely love to take it.
They're based out of Illinois, but they go all through the U.S. And there's other really good schools. I mentioned a couple of them. Behavioral Analysis Training Institute and Interrogation Institute by Skip Rogers is based out of Folsom, California. It's an excellent school. And if I'll make the offer now, you don't have to take me up on it, but just consider it. If your agency is by any chance interested in this type of training, I'd be happy to give an introductory class for a day of pro bono. I've got no problem, doing it as long as I'm not out of pocket, having to fly out to
that would be
Massachusetts
awesome.
And back.
That'd be awesome. I would love that.
I'm not trying. I don't want to take their work away from them because, quite honestly, I think that it's important to have credible experts that deal with this subject matter, confession evidence, that have experience in law enforcement. And right now, at least the last time I checked, in Los Angeles County, where I was on the expert panel for the court, Los Angeles County Superior Court, there were, I think, 4 other experts on the panel, and every single one of them were academics. In one case, he's a very well-known law professor in UC San Francisco. None of these people have actually had experience conducting interviews and interrogations as a peace officer, and none of them have had the responsibility of ensuring that they've got a good work product as a result of using best practices. They're all from the academic arena, and I think it's important to have at least one cop that can talk to judges and juries about this subject matter from an experiential standpoint, not just things they learned from books, but haven't actually put into practice.
Absolutely. And that was a problem we had here when they were setting police reform for Massachusetts last year. That's what we heard through the grapevine. It was all academics. There was like one cop on the panel of all these people. And I think the chiefs of police all pushed back really hard and said, whoa. If we're going to do this thing, the governor needs a few more police officers on that panel. People that do it.
Absolutely.
So, and I believe that did happen, which is good.
Well, I've spent, well over 20 years using these kind of techniques as a cop, and I spent the last 13 using this type of training and experience as a defense resource. And there's nothing like it when you're dealing with a case where you actually have someone that's actually innocent. Nothing like it. It's can I give you one more war story?
Yeah, let it rip.
If you recall, I started my career in the mid-1970s working as a non-sworn part-time employee for the city of San Fernando Police Department. And I subsequently became a reserve officer there. And I worked for San Fernando PD for about 5 years, including my part-time status and my status as a reserve police officer for a couple of years before going to Santa Monica PD and going to the LA Community College District Police Department as an officer assigned to LA Mission College, which is located in San Fernando. And in that time period from 75 to 1980, I developed some friendships with people that worked in San Fernando PD, and one of them was an officer by the name of Dennis Webb. Dennis was in his mid-30s when he was hired after serving our country in the Navy. And he went through the academy while I was CSO in San Fernando. And when he graduated from the academy and worked as a police officer there, and I became a reserve officer, I would work with him on occasion as a partner. And after I had been hired by the LA Community College District Police Department in 1979, Dennis and I collaborated as officers, as he had worked in San Fernando PD and I worked in a college that was a storefront operation, mostly in the city of San Fernando. And one of the things that the college that I worked at did to supplement the full-time officers, I think there were just 2 or 3 of us that actually it was 3 officers or 2 officers and a supervisor that worked full-time at Mission College in 1980. One of the things that we did to supplement our personnel needs was to hire full-time officers from other agencies to work for us on a part-time basis. And Dennis expressed an interest in working for us. And I talked to my boss. She checked with San Fernando PD, and Dennis was going to come on board as a part-time officer, either at the end of 1980 or shortly after New Year's in 81. And I came into work on Christmas Eve morning, December 24th, 1980, and saw my boss shortly after arriving around 7:30 or 8 o'clock. And she had a kind of unusual look on her face, and she said, "Did I hear about Dennis?" And I said, "No. What, did you hear something about a hire date for him?" And she looked away for a moment and then looks back at me and she said, "No, Dennis was shot and killed last night, or actually early this morning. He'd made some kind of a pedestrian stop, and the suspect had shot him to death and left the scene in his patrol car." So this incident and what happened afterwards had a big impact on me. As it turned out, Dennis had come on to the shift around midnight the previous evening, and there had been an armed robbery that occurred at a liquor store just outside the city of San Fernando on Foothill Boulevard in LAPD Foothill Division. The clerk in this liquor store had called the police to report that he'd been robbed at gunpoint. He provided a very general description of the offender being a male, white, late teens, early 20s, dark clothing. And he'd heard a motorcycle leaving the scene, but didn't see anything. LAPD had broadcast this information, and San Fernando PD officers at the time, and I believe they still do, had monitors in their car so they could overhear the dispatch calls from their surrounding jurisdictions, be it LAPD, Foothill Division, Van Nuys Division, Devonshire. I don't think what's the new Valley Division that's up there near Devonshire? They have another station out there now. They have another station. I don't remember what the name of it is, but so San Fernando PD was aware of this robbery that occurred. It was about 12:30 a.m. And Dennis was just coming on to shift when this happened. At about 3:30, 3:45 a.m., when everything else is closed, Dennis requested and was approved to take his lunch break, and he went to Holy Cross Hospital, which is just outside the city limits of San Fernando, in the Mission Hills area of LAPD Foothill. And he took his lunch break in the emergency room, chatting with the doctor and nurses that were on staff at the time. And when he was done, he returned to San Fernando. And as he entered the South City limits, he radioed to dispatch a request for any additional information on the suspect description of the offender that committed the robbery on Foothill Boulevard, which is located about 5 miles from the South City limits of San Fernando. So Foothill's up north of the city limits of San Fernando. Dennis was coming in from the south city limits of San Fernando. He had about 3 hours or so that transpired. And the dispatcher contacted LAPD. They had the same general information they put out earlier because there was a language barrier. The victim, robbery, I think he was Pakistani, so he was having some difficulty providing additional information other than what was put out earlier. So Dennis advised over the radio that he had a subject that he was going to be stopping to investigate, a pedestrian. And he gave the intersection and he requested backup. And another officer that was working that night and the supervisor responded from the police station to the location Dennis had provided, and they were there inside of 2 minutes. So when the request for backup was made, there was a timestamp. When they arrived at the scene, there was a timestamp. And when they arrived, they found Dennis unconscious on the sidewalk, bleeding to death. Dennis's gun was still in its holster. Dennis's police car was gone. They struggled to get they struggled to get Dennis in the back seat of the police car, and they drove him code 3 to the same emergency room where he'd had lunch. And despite their best off efforts, Dennis passed away at that scene. And obviously for a department that had, I think it was less than 30 full-time officers at the time, this is a huge event. Very, very difficult for them to deal with, very stressful. They were very much pressed in terms of the amount of investigative personnel that were available. And the LA County Sheriff's Department came out, conducted an investigation. They recovered shell casings at the scene. And several hours later, Dennis's police car was found in the Sepulveda Dam Basin park area, which is just south and west of the intersections of the 405 freeway and the 134, if you know where that is. No one was seen leaving the vehicle, and I don't think they recovered any kind of fingerprints, and this is long before DNA evidence. Every investigative lead that came in was followed up on, and they didn't have anything good until shortly after the first of the new year in 1981, when they received a call from a law enforcement agency in another state about a guy that they had in custody for a double murder that occurred. And they were really certain that this guy had committed this other murder. They had ballistics evidence. They had eyewitnesses. He was making statements. And while he was in their custody, he was bragging to other inmates in the custody facility that he killed a cop in Los Angeles just before Christmas. So you get that kind of information, obviously that's going to be a high priority.
Yeah.
And the sergeant that was working detectives at the time, a guy named Dom Ravetti, great guy, who I believe right now is the acting chief of police of Beverly Hills. He was until very recently, if he's not still in that position.
Big money.
Dom went out to this other law enforcement agency along with a investigator from the LA County Sheriff's Department, Homicide Bureau, and prosecutor from the LADA's office. And they interviewed this guy. And according to Dom, this suspect made a number of different statements about his involvement, some admitting involvement, and then shortly after he'd deny it, some claiming that he'd used one kind of weapon that didn't match the ballistics evidence they recovered at the scene, other times saying that he used a different weapon that may have matched the ballistics evidence at the scene. When they walked out after that interview, Dom Dom told me later and over the years that he had a lot of mixed feelings about whether or not this guy is credible, especially when you added on top of it the fact that this guy had been treated for mental illness for years prior to this incident. But based upon what information and evidence they did have, it was the decision of the prosecutor, who, to the best of my knowledge, had never had any formal interview and interrogation training, to go ahead and file charges of murder against this guy. And he was subsequently extradited to Los Angeles to stand trial for Dennis's murder. He was in custody for a month or two. And in that time period, there was a young lady that was attending a mining institute in New Mexico, a college that taught young people the science and the technology involved with mining. And she overheard one of the students talking about having done something horrible while he was at home visiting family for Christmas in the San Fernando Selmar area. This young man had never been arrested for a crime before. But she was concerned enough about the things that she overheard that she told her mother, who was a dispatcher for the New Mexico State Police. And her mother believed that the information was concerning enough. And I don't think she knew anything about Dennis Webb's killing or the person that was in custody. But she was concerned enough about what she overheard that she told her superiors and was referred to the FBI. The FBI contacted the LA County Sheriff's Department, and the sheriff's investigators and Dom Bravetti got together with investigators from New Mexico who did a background on this guy and found out that he was believed to have been involved in a burglary in the area of the mining college. And they learned that he had purchased a handgun just weeks prior to Dennis's murder, the ballistics of which would be similar to the casings found at the scene. They did some more follow-up, and they found out that the person that sold him the handgun had reloaded ammunition for his own use, and it included a box of this reloaded ammunition when he sold the gun to this guy. And he led them to a location where expended shell casings from the gun that he'd owned at the time and subsequently sold to this guy were located along with bullets. And they were ballistically matched to the rounds that were found at the scene. So now they're looking at this guy being a potential, and somebody else is already charged. They ended up arresting him. They conducted an interrogation. And not only did this guy admit to killing Dennis Webb, but he provided specifics about where and when and how that crime occurred, including the fact that Dennis drove past him 3 times, apparently while he was waiting for dispatch to see if there was additional information before he made the stop. And that when Dennis did make the stop, that he did a very low-key, keeping his gun in his holster, which enabled this guy to get the drop on him and assassinate Dennis during the stop. And it ultimately resulted in... and I'm not going to use his name because it still makes me sick to know that he was never, he was charged with murder, first-degree murder of a peace officer in the performance of his duties. And the DA's office never attempted to get the death penalty on the table because he had such a young face. But he was convicted of that murder and sentenced to life without possibility of parole. I believe he's still in Folsom Prison. But here's the point I want to make. Obviously, the first guy that they arrested didn't commit the crime. And he was subsequently released to be prosecuted for the murders that he did commit in those other states. But I tell this story not just to cops, But I tell this story to defense attorneys and defense investigators with this in mind, and that is, do you think that there's any cop anywhere that would want to see the murderer of a police officer go free while an innocent third party was convicted of that crime?
No.
I can't. I don't think that, especially hearing the things that I overheard my fellow officers saying in San Fernando after Dennis was killed, that the last thing they'd want to do is see that assassin escape justice. And I don't have any doubt that the officers, including Sergeant at the time, Ravetti, acted with the best intentions in arresting that first person. They certainly acted in good faith, and they used the best training that they had. But how good was that training, and how does it compare to the type of training that I'm describing here? So if you want to see cops do the right job and be sure that they get confessions or admissions that are reliable and corroborated, it's going to require training. And that means experiential training after they get the basics of formal training. And that experiential training has got to begin early in their career when they're patrol officers.
Yeah, I agree.
And that's what I said earlier about learning from things that happen to us in life. That's something I learned in Dennis's case. And that's part of the reason that I got involved in this to the degree that I do. And it's something that I keep in mind when I'm training people.
That's great. And it's wonderful that is, it's an awful, tragic thing, but it, his passing, his murder had purpose and has, probably changed the course of a lot of investigations because of it, and, affected your life and affected consequently all your investigations for the better, which is a good thing.
Well, I had the honor last December of speaking with Dennis's widow for a while. And like I said, he was killed in December 1980. So the 24th of December of 2020 was the 40th anniversary of his death. And people should know about this. Cops should know about this. And those served by cops ought to know about this. And those that care about the quality of work we do, they should know about it and think about it. Absolutely.
Gary, we're going on 2 hours, my brother. Awesome interview. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Way too verbose.
Believe it or not, the fans of the show love it. I get notes all the time. Make them longer. Make the interviews go longer, so they're gonna love, because people listen to this when they're working out, they're on their commute. You know what I mean? So this is great, man. You're a friend of the show. You believe in the show. You support the show, and you provided the show with like 4 hours of content. Now everybody should be like Gary Steiner when it comes to the show. And I have a feeling I could have you on again if I could impose myself.
I'm retired. I'm honored to be on anytime you want me. Feel free to offer an invite. And if it's subject matter that I've got the expertise in, for heaven's sake, do not ever invite me on to talk about traffic accident investigation or reconstruction. Way outside my purview. But interview and interrogation, use of deadly force, best practices, things like that. And if you want to hear about the dark side and working for the defense and the kind of things that you see, I think you'd find it really interesting. Obviously, I've got to toe the line when it comes to attorney-client privilege, because that also applies to investigative resources.
Sure.
For criminal defendants, but I'd be happy to give you some stories without names And I think that you might be surprised by how much respect you end up giving the people that are working on the other side, because they do have a job to do, and they aren't all scum-sucking lowlifes like I've told some of my grandchildren over the years. Some are pretty damn good people that I've actually enjoyed working with and admired for the kind of work that they do and the dedication that they demonstrate.
Awesome. I'm absolutely sure. The great Gary Steiner. Gary, thank you so much for coming on. Let me do the outro, put you in the green room, and you hang on for a second when I do that?
Sure. No hurry.
Great. Guys, this has been episode number 86. The great Gary Steiner came back, court-recognized expert on confession evidence. Had a great time. Could talk to Gary for hours and hours, of course. If I wanted any more time, my wife would have my head because I can hear the kids stomping around upstairs. Always a blast. Sounds like we can get him back. Gary's the gift that keeps on giving. He's got so much knowledge, so much expertise. Truly thankful to have him. Guys, go check out lifespotapp.com. Brett Titus is the founder of that. He's a past guest, and the company's just phenomenal. It's Brett Titus, so Brett at lifespotapp.com. Brett at lifespotapp.com. Go check out that product. It's phenomenal. The first official sponsor of the podcast, and I'm proud, very proud to have it. Thank you to all the sponsors. Thank you guys for checking out the show. If you want to be a guest, always searching for guests, go to thingspleasesee.com. And you can just scroll down and click on Be a Guest. Give me a quick synopsis, of a few different things you've experienced, how long you've worked for. I do request that you've departed your agency in good standing and that you're not wanting to come on to reveal the underbelly of your agency. Or I do get guys who want to do that. I don't want to do that. I just want some stories, some inspirational stuff, some advice for young recruits. If you want to take your agency down, as it were, do that in a book or on a blog or something else on your own time. I'm not interested in those kinds of guests. I do get those more than I would like. So I just want to put that out there. Now, nothing against you, but I just don't want to get involved in that kind of stuff. So thank you, everybody. Appreciate it, and I'll see you for the next one.